Your body wouldn't simply shut down all at once. It would begin to fail piece by piece. First, your fingers would stiffen. Then your breath would grow shallow. By morning, your eyes might still be open, frozen in place. A single medieval winter storm didn't need weeks to end your life. All it needed was one brutal day. But what made just 24 hours so deadly, especially for those who never even left their homes? It all began the moment you laid down to sleep. A medieval bed was nothing more than a rough heap of wool blankets and coarse animal skins thrown over a lumpy straw mattress. Imagine trying to rest on something that felt like a sack of angry animals. There were no heaters, no warmth coming from vents, just the shrieking wind slicing through every gap in the walls like invisible blades. Homes during this era were basically cold traps. They had no insulation. The stones that made up the walls had gaps wide enough to let in freezing air and snow. Your house preserved cold better than a modern fridge preserves leftovers. The dirt floor beneath your feet would freeze into a solid sheet of ice. Hearth fires only gave warmth to those sitting directly in front of them, within maybe a 3-foot radius. Step back just a few feet, and it was like standing in the heart of the storm itself. You could literally see your breath clouding in front of you, even indoors. That was medieval central heating, a flickering fire that couldn't commit. At night, people piled on every piece of clothing they owned. Whole families slept together under whatever they could find: blankets, skins, even sacks. Some families even brought livestock into their homes to steal extra warmth from their bodies. Sleeping beside a goat or chicken wasn't strange. It was survival. But hypothermia didn't announce itself. It crept in silently while you slept. Many simply never opened their eyes again. By sunrise, they were found still and lifeless, frozen in the same positions they fell asleep in. And yet the dangers of night were nothing compared to the brutal tests the morning brought. Every morning began with a fight to spark a fire from nothing. There were no matches, no lighters, only flint and steel, and hands so frozen they could barely move. Trying to create fire under those conditions was like attempting surgery with numb hands and blindfolded eyes. Every source of water turned solid by nightfall. Wells transformed into useless pillars of ice. To get a single drink, you'd need to hack through thick ice with tools, using hands that couldn't even hold them properly. It was like trying to play piano with fists instead of fingers. And you couldn't ignore the animals, no matter how deadly it was outside. Cows still needed to be milked. Chickens still needed to eat. Medieval farming wasn't just back-breaking. It was like running an outdoor cafe for creatures that didn't tip. But going outside meant risking your life. Wind strong enough to knock you off your feet. Snow deep enough to bury fences. And visibility so poor you could die just walking between your house and the barn. To prevent getting lost in their own yards, people tied ropes between buildings. Everything was slick with ice, turning even a short walk into a life-threatening journey. One fall while carrying water, and you could drench yourself in sub-zero air. If you accidentally cut yourself while using tools, you might not notice until the blood loss was severe. Your hands were too numb to feel anything. Every single task came with the risk of injury, frostbite, or death. But skipping those tasks meant starvation. You were forced to choose between doing something dangerous or facing guaranteed ruin. And what you wore didn't make the decision any easier. Winter clothing back then was mostly just rough wool and linen. No layers, no waterproof outerwear, no high-tech fabrics. Most people owned only one outfit. Not one winter outfit. One outfit, period. Their shoes? Thin strips of leather or cloth barely tied together. No rubber soles, no insulation, and certainly no waterproofing. Imagine tying a wet leather sack around your feet and walking through snow in that. Once soaked, they stayed wet for days. Frozen feet meant frostbite, infections, and permanent damage. As for gloves, those were rare luxuries. Most people used their bare, cracked hands to grip frozen tools and carry icy buckets. Fingers would split open, bleed, and grow stiff with cold. Try chopping firewood with hands that can't even close. Cloaks offered little real protection. They flapped in the wind like oversized flags, providing only the illusion of warmth. Wearing one in a snowstorm was like trying to block a hurricane with a towel. And once your clothes got wet, that was it. You had to wear them until they dried on your body. In winter, that could take days. Wet clothing clinging to freezing skin created a perfect recipe for pneumonia and other lethal respiratory diseases. You couldn't just change into a fresh set because you didn't have one. If your cloak tore or your shoes broke, you either fixed them yourself or went without. By late winter, many people were walking around in outfits that were more patchwork than cloth. But as miserable as the cold was, the food situation might have been even worse. Food during the medieval winter was mostly salted meat so tough it could be mistaken for lumber, dried peas from the last harvest, and bread so hard it could double as a weapon. Eating was like chewing on old furniture. There was no such thing as fresh fruit or vegetables for months. Milk only came if your livestock survived and produced during the cold. Vitamin deficiencies were common. Scurvy, rickets, night blindness. These weren't rare. They were expected. Salt was the main method of preservation, but it ruined the flavor and texture of meat. To make it edible, people had to soak it for hours. Most of the time, it still felt like gnawing on a salted boot. Worse still, too much salt made people unbearably thirsty. And when water sources were frozen solid, getting clean water became another uphill battle. Rotten food, moldy bread, and questionable meat weren't avoided, they were eaten. Because in a world where starvation waited outside your door, food poisoning was a safer gamble. Storage wasn't much help either. Barrels and sacks didn't keep out pests or moisture. Rats, bugs, and mold were constant visitors. Grain turned into infested powder. Keeping food was like throwing a banquet for every pest within miles. By late winter, most meals were just thin soups made from bones and table scraps. Sometimes just hot water with salt, just to pretend it was food. Children cried from constant hunger. Adults grew lightheaded and sluggish from starvation. And whatever little food you managed to keep safe had to be defended. Houses weren't locked. Most doors were held together with rope and hope. Windows were just holes covered by fabric or thin boards. Security in the medieval winter was a fantasy. Neighbors who were kind in the summer could turn dangerous when desperation set in. Hunger turned friends into thieves. The wind and snow muffled the sounds of forced entry. And by the time you realized someone was in your home, it was too late. In the end, winter wasn't just a season. It was a test of will, of endurance, and of luck. The cold didn't discriminate. It didn't care how strong or smart you were. It just waited for the moment you dropped your guard. Bandits stalked the frost-covered countryside, their eyes scanning for vulnerable farms and remote villages. These weren't the romanticized outlaws sung about in legends. They were starving, desperate, and ruthless people who would wipe out entire families for nothing more than a sack of grain. Winter storms made their raids even more lethal. In those whiteouts, no one could flee, and no help could reach you in time. Theft of firewood became disturbingly common. People couldn't survive the cold without fuel, and collecting firewood was exhausting, often taking hours of chopping, splitting, and hauling. For many, it was easier and deadlier to steal it. Taking someone's firewood was the slow-motion murder of their household, one stolen log at a time. Livestock raids were equally devastating. Cattle weren't just animals. They were a lifeline, offering milk, meat, and the muscle needed to plow fields or pull carts. Losing your animals meant losing your food, your ability to work the land, and your only form of transport, all in one cruel blow. Raiders often struck during fierce blizzards, knowing that tracking them would be impossible until it was far too late. In these desperate winters, justice wasn't something you could count on. There were no sheriffs riding out into snowdrifts, no courts in session. When survival was on the line, people had no choice but to defend their homes with whatever weapons they had, or risk losing everything they needed to stay alive. But even if a family protected their food, firewood, and animals, a far more invisible enemy waited indoors. Medicine in the medieval world was a chaotic mix of old superstition and random guesses. Most doctors had no real understanding of the human body. They were closer to mystics wielding blades than actual healers. Pneumonia and respiratory infections spread through the damp, unheated houses like wildfire, claiming entire households in just a few weeks. Nobody knew about bacteria or viruses. There were no antibiotics, no sterilization, just trial, error, and pain. Bloodletting was considered state-of-the-art treatment. Physicians believed draining a person's blood could cure their illness, but in reality, it only weakened the body further, bringing death closer. Even herbal remedies ranged wildly in effectiveness, from harmless to downright poisonous. The prevailing belief was that foul odors caused disease, so people filled their homes with overpowering herbs, trying to mask the stench of sickness rather than fix the real problems, like contaminated water, mold, or lack of ventilation. In many ways, medieval air fresheners were the healthcare system. When bones broke, they rarely healed correctly. There was no proper setting or splints, just crude guesses. A simple fracture often led to a lifetime of disability. Infected wounds could turn septic within days. Dental infections spread to the brain. And as for mental health, it wasn't even recognized. People with depression, anxiety, or trauma were often seen as cursed or possessed, abandoned by their families and communities. A simple fever could be fatal. Lacking the most basic understanding of how infections worked, even minor illnesses became death sentences. The elderly and children were the first to perish. But starvation, disease, and relentless cold eventually caught up to even the strongest adults. And all of this horror happened inside houses, if you were lucky enough to still have one. The roofs of medieval homes were made of thatch, essentially a fragile mix of straw and mud piled into place with more hope than structural sense. In heavy snow, these roofs would buckle under the weight, and when they collapsed, they crushed everything beneath, sometimes with entire families still inside. Ice was another silent destroyer. Water would seep into every tiny crack in wood or stone. Then it froze and expanded, splitting massive beams apart like twigs. Homes were slowly torn open from the inside out by freezing water. Leaks turned interiors into soggy breeding grounds for mold. Everything stayed wet, rotting, and unlivable for months on end. The cold didn't just creep in, it shattered homes from within. And as families tried to stay warm, they faced another horrifying risk: fire. Crude fireplaces and poorly constructed chimneys often threw sparks onto flammable thatch roofs. In trying to fight off the cold, many families accidentally burned alive. Repairing storm damage in the middle of a blizzard was nearly impossible. One brutal storm could reduce your shelter to wreckage. and there was no rebuilding until spring. That is, if you survived until then. But threats didn't just come from nature. Sometimes, they came clawing from the darkness beyond the walls. Wolves, driven by starvation, crept closer to human settlements during the coldest months. The smell of stored meat, the faint warmth of a hearth, these were enough to lure predators to the very edge of your home. At night, they would circle, waiting. Villagers had no real way to defend against them, just locked doors and prayers. Bears would wander in from frozen forests, crashing into villages like living wrecking balls, desperate for food. Rats and mice overrun food stores, spreading diseases like plague and typhus. Pest control? Mostly just hope that nature wouldn't push any harder. But the most frightening invaders weren't always animals. They were other people. Starving, half-frozen wanderers didn't knock politely. They broke in, ready to kill for shelter or a scrap of bread. Neighbors turned into threats. Farmers became raiders. Hunger didn't just break the body, it shattered trust, turning communities into nests of fear and suspicion. And when night came, the fear only deepened. With no real lighting, the world outside turned to pitch. You couldn't see what was coming, or hear it, until it was at your door. In the medieval world, winter wasn't just cold, it was a siege. Hunger, disease, fire, wild beasts, even your own kind, everything became a threat. Every breath was a risk. Every night, a test of survival. A level of suffering that modern comfort has made nearly unimaginable. But here's something strange to ask. If dropped into that world for 1 week, would you survive? Or lose your humanity first? For more haunting truths from the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths, where history reveals its darkest corners.